Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Welcome to Animated Documentaries, Drawing a Line Over Reality. My name's St. John Walker, and I'm an independent VFX and animation advisor. And I'm also the chair of 4 industry panels each year at LIAF. Now, animation isn't the obvious medium for documentary making, but the two have always been combined, sometimes with startling effects. Animated documentaries can bring new voices to an audience. The animated form can often go where the film camera can't. Animated documentaries can be another way of communicating your truth or perspective. We brought together a group of animators and directors to talk about the value of animated documentaries and how, maybe in an era of deep fakes and misinformation, they may be more useful than ever. So with me are animators Jonathan Hodgson, Samantha Moore, Mary Martins, and Alex Widdowson. So first of all, I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourself and talk maybe a bit about your practice and what drives you. And I'm going to start, if it's okay, with Alex. Tell us about yourself and your practice. What drives you?
Thank you, Saint. I'm an animated documentary director exclusively. I've sort of mostly done animated documentaries since I was in my undergraduate. And these are the majority of films I've directed. I'm also the festival director for Factual Animation Film Festival, a small animated documentary focused short film festival. And I'm a researcher and educator. I've just handed in my PhD on animated documentary ethics. And so I guess what motivates me in the field, I think is this idea that I've always been fascinated by how people live in the world and see it through their own subjective lens. And that's a way of sort of factual storytelling that accounts for our subjectivity, animated documentary. And that's always fascinated me, as I think it has for other members of the panel.
Thank you very much, Alex. Let's move on to Jonathan.
Hi. I'm Jonathan Hodgson. I've been an animator since I was about 19, so a very long time. And most of the stuff I've done, I mean, wasn't really always thought of as animated documentary, but I suppose going back to even the first film that I made that went into a festival, it was kind of factual and based on, I say, more observation. I'm an observational animator rather than a documentary animator, although some of the things I've done have been called animated documentaries. And I also teach. I run the animation degree, or I jointly run the animation degree at Middlesex University. I don't know what drives me. I've always drawn pictures, and that's the main thing I've done in my life. I just keep doing it.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary. I'm a documentary animator and experimental filmmaker. I think I didn't quite know I was making animated documentaries initially. I just was really interested in sort of how animation could be used as this kind of political and social tool, and just a way of kind of storing, kind of preserving histories and stories and kind of reconnecting with our past. So it kind of became this very mixed media, collage style way of working with documentary modes of investigation. I think what motivates me is probably just sharing kind of untold stories and stories that a lot of people wouldn't get to hear, and being able to share people's lived experiences and just forming these new relationships and meeting new people. I think that's one of the things that I love most about animated documentary.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, Samantha Moore.
Hello, I'm Sam Moore. I'm an independent animated documentary maker. I have a collaborative approach to the work that I do, and I've got an interest in representing science. So my PhD was about using animation to document interior brain states. I also teach animation at the Royal College of Art, which is really thrilling to kind of be in touch with a new generation of emerging artists in animation. I also have got a film at LIAF screening this year, in the British Showcase, which is Visible Mending, which is an animated documentary about emotional repair through yarn. So yeah, what drives me is, I don't know, fear, caffeine, bankruptcy looming, I don't know, mortgage, you know, stuff like normal stuff. Yeah. Curiosity, real nosiness. I think you have to be really nosy to be an animated documentary maker.
Thank you. And just so the audience knows, if you have any burning questions for our group here, do put them in the chat. We don't see your particular chat, but our gremlin behind the scenes, Claude, will collect them and show them to us. So if at any time you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. But I've got a whole range of questions, and as I'm sure you appreciate, we could go on for a very long time, but we've only got an hour and a tiny bit. So let me go with one question, which straight off, and that is the phenomenon, if you like, of animated documentaries. Do you find there's an appetite for animated documentaries, especially amongst commissioners and streamers, or is it still seen as something sort of maybe not part of the animation canon? So who would like to answer that?
From what I've picked up is commissioners aren't usually that not so interested in animated documentaries, not kind of people like the BFI anyway, as far as I know. They're kind of more into comedy. That I might be wrong about that. But
I disagree entirely with that. Yeah, no, I don't think that's true at all. I think animated documentary has been really kind of accepted really quickly. I think it's kind of really interesting. I think, yeah, well, BFI commissioned my film, which is an animated documentary, but they also commissioned Ellie Land's film, which is also an animated documentary about wild swimming, which is amazing. Yeah,
completely wrong. But yeah, it's not some. I mean, I don't know. I haven't had much luck with getting commissioned. I've found that I've been approached by people to make animated documentaries, but I haven't had much luck. I've had a bit of luck, but yeah, it's maybe I've gone to the wrong people.
I think there's
nevertheless, yeah, go on, Alex.
I think there's a sort of, as with the actual genre itself, there's a sort of cultural clash between documentary commissioners and animation commissioners. I think it's quite appealing for independent short animation to be commissioned by the BFI, for instance, because it sort of adds often a sort of mission and a social mission to what they're able to put out there in their sort of commissioned content. But from where that already exists in the documentary features world or the sort of broader documentary practice, I think what the commissioners are suddenly confronted with is the fact that these films will cost 5, 6, 10 times as much to produce as a sort of observational documentary using cameras. So that's a sort of ongoing problem that I don't see a simple solution to. Every now and then you get a big sort of investment from state funders, say in France or Denmark or Israel, places like that, where there's real investment in state funding, much more so than the UK.
Yeah, Mary, what do you think? Do you find commissioners and streamers understand what animated documentary is in the first place?
Yeah, I just think there's a lack of understanding with what it actually is. So I think again, it gets kind of separated from sort of more traditional documentary live action filmmaking. But I see the two as pretty much the same. And in actual fact, I think animation enhances sort of live action as well. And that's something that I play around with and I explore through my own work. But yeah, I think these very traditional narrative forms of storytelling are still quite dominant within sort of the animation industry. And I think it's such a small group of people that are kind of embarking on this very challenging way of approaching sort of the world around us. So I think it's it should be more, there should be more funding, but I've kind of noticed that there's not as much funding available for animated documentary.
Thank you. And I'm going to go back to something that you said a bit earlier, I think, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I'd like all of you to answer this one. And this is, Can you talk to this idea that animated documentaries can give a voice to people who don't have one through traditional media routes? I know that's not the whole of animated documentaries, but it is an important component which I've seen in some of your work. So can you tell me a bit more about this idea that animated documentaries can give a voice to people who don't have one traditionally through media? Alex, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting sort of peculiarity about animated documentary independent productions, which is that there is a tendency to work with marginalized or vulnerable participants. And I think this relates to the medium's ability to protect a participant's identity through sort of changing the visual appearance of their face. It's also to do with what Bella Honoris-Rowe would call evocation, which is a sort of a capacity to and an interest in simulating, as Sam referred to earlier, brain state phenomena or subjective points of view. And so with those tools comes an interest in people who might be neurodivergent, disabled, experience mental health suffering. So I think, yes, these films have a tendency to focus on marginalized communities and vulnerable people. And obviously, I'm particularly interested in the sort of ethical responsibilities that come with that in my research.
But it's more than that, though, isn't it? It's more like animated documentary allows you to kind of like make manifest an interiority, which doesn't always come over when you plonk a cat. Like we're a bunch of talking heads on a screen today, and all you're really going to get is that I've got quite a badly behaved dog behind me. And you know, you're going to get these superficial kind of stuff about our jumper wearing, you know, or whatever. But you're not going to sort of understand about the like the way we see the world, and you know, if we're colorblind or if we're monocular or if we're, you know, neurodivergent or whatever. So animated documentary does allow you to do that, but also it kind of like opens up maybe types of filmmaking to different audiences as well. You know, independent animation is pretty talks to a pretty small audience sometimes, and you know, by opening up diverse types of collaborators and interviewees, you're also opening up more diverse audiences, which I think is of interest to all of us as artists. Who are we speaking to? You
know? Mary, have you? Sorry, Jonathan, go ahead.
I know, Mary.
Oh yeah, no, just quickly. Yeah, I was thinking back to a project that I've just finished, and I remember the participants, like a couple of them not feeling comfortable being behind the camera. And I was like, yeah, this is actually one of the benefits of sort of animation with documentary forms, because yeah, there are a lot of people, you work with people in the community and they just not very confident and not very comfortable behind the camera. But also some of these stories are so personal that they would rather just tell you and you kind of record it. So for me, I have a very journalistic approach as well, because I don't know when that story is going to come. It's all very last minute for me, and I have to be ready to run out with some kind of recorder or my iPhone or something to get. It's all about the animation is kind of, I capture these moments and then the animation kind of forms all of these elements together in a way.
Yeah, Mary's kind of made the point I was about to make, actually, because I was going to say that a lot of people, for certain circumstances or reasons, they don't want to be shown on camera. I mean, I made a film a few years ago which was interviewing people who were in relationship counselling, and it was they wouldn't have been in the film if they had if they're going to be filmed on live action. They were very, you know, they didn't. It's like they didn't want to be judged, I guess, and but also, I mean, you know, I know Tony Cumley made a film about where they were interviewing mafia. Obviously, they don't. If we want to give a voice to the mafia, animated documentary is the ideal form. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so what I'd like to do now, if it's okay with you, is do a bit of a deeper dive into each one of your subjects and your practice. And if I can start off with Sam, I've got a few questions for you, but I wondered, do you want me to show the trailer to Visible Mending now? Because my first question is about Visible Mending.
Yeah,
okay,
please.
so this is the less seamless part of our display. So just bear with me whilst I get it ready. And okay, so this should work. And here we go. Okay, so this is Visible Mending.
There's something about, you know, when your life is sort of falling apart, you need to create a purpose in it for yourself. And if that purpose is quite small, it doesn't matter. It's important. It was something tangible.
Really interesting. It acts as almost like a biofeedback as well, because the more stressed you are, the tighter your stitches tend to be, so you can learn to knit more loosely and relax your shoulders and relax into the flow of movement of your hands.
Thank you. Sam, do you want to say a few words about that, just for a bit of context before I ask any questions?
Yeah, so Visible Mending was a short animated documentary I made. It was funded by BFI Short Form Funding, which was really exciting because it's a big pot of funding for independent British animation, and it allowed me to change my practice. So normally I'm a 2D animator, and I was able to make this as a stop motion film, which I hadn't done before, which was absolutely dictated by the conversations with the interviewees, the form we took. It became really clear that it would kind of need to be stop motion, which is not my area. So by having that funding, I was able then to work with stop motion animators. And it took 5 years, and I worked with a group of knitters from Shropshire. And it was, first of all, we got a tiny bit of seed funding, and we just kind of started it off like that. Yeah, sorry, I could bore for England on this, so don't ask me too many questions.
Oh, don't worry, because I've got a question for you. So, Visible Mending sort of represents knitting, if you like, as a way people can regain agency and calm. I think you use the phrase emotional repair through wool. When developing these ideas, how aware are you of what the end result will look like? You know, do you have a kind of path that you go down which is very linear, or do you get taken all over the place with, you know, the responses you get?
Yeah, I think that's, for me, that's the exciting thing about documentaries. You never really know how it's going to turn out. And that's true for all documentary, I think. You know, most documentarians will say, you know, you pitch something, you've no real idea how it's going to turn out. And one of the reasons that I always mention how long this film took is because we did work on it for sort of 3.5 years, and I think we had something like £3,000 in entirety for it, you know. So it was like just pursuing that idea, and I made other films and I was doing other work, and you know, you kind of, and you always have a few ideas on the boil, because otherwise some of them just go off the boil and they never happen, and some of them kind of, you know, coalesce into something really interesting and you can pursue them. So yeah, I think I didn't really have a strong idea at the beginning, and by the end I had a really, really strong idea and no idea how I was going to do it, because I don't know how to do stop motion. So yeah.
Have you ever had an idea which, you know, almost like being totally overhauled because of your interaction with the subject?
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, so I pursue, like, so I use a kind of collaborative methodology. So when I did my PhD, it was, you know, about my contribution to original research was about the methodology and about the way that I sort of use a collaborative cycle, and that involves a lot. It's a really time-consuming, long process, and completely inappropriate and terrible for getting money, because you never, you know, you sort of always go over time. But a way of kind of developing this collaborative cycle with them in order to, you know, really involve them into bring them in, sort of almost knit them into the frame. So with the characters in Visible Mending, they all chose their own knitted objects. So this is Carmel and this is the hat. So Carmel knitted 3 of these hats. She knits pixie hats almost obsessively, I'm sure she won't mind me saying, but so she knits these hats, and so she knitted 3 of them, and they represent her in the film. Another so Lorna Hamilton Brown, who's a really amazing textile artist, she knitted the birds in the film, and we knitted some more of them to kind of add to the flock, but she started them off, and then everyone else knitted they chose their patterns, and then we knitted them for them. So it's kind of like bringing the collaborator into the frame is a really important part of it. Sorry, I don't think I answered your question.
No, well, that's fine, because, you know, my question really was whether anybody, I guess it's about the power, you know, have they got the power to sort of totally kibosh your idea? And
yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I think up to a point they do, but I think as a director, the balance kind of shifts. You know, at the beginning and development stage, you're really open and you have to be led by your collaborators, because how else are you going to kind of find out what your story is? But then as you get closer and closer to the end and you start to edit, obviously then you have much more power as director. And I think it's just about being open and transparent about the power shift as it happens, and just sort of like making it clear that, you know, you've had input into the story and you will continue to, and yet there comes a point where you can no longer alter. So you can sort of send animatic stage work out to collaborators and ask them to comment and input, but once you start to animate, it's like, well, no, you can't change the color of that now. That's not, it's like working with any client, you know, working with clients, working with commissioners, you know, like it's collaborative up to a point, and then I think you just have to be clear about your, you know, the way it's working is, no, in fact, I'm going to take this back now, and this becomes a film that I directed, my name on it, you know. Yeah.
And one of, you know, we talked about sort of giving voice to marginalised communities, etc. And you could argue one of the marginalised communities is the scientific community, and you've worked on the language of shapes with Professor Serge Mostow. And obviously, I'm very keen on that idea of like bringing sort of like things that can't be seen to life through animation as well. Do you detect that there's a willingness in this sort of scientific community to embrace new ways of visualizing internal processes?
Yeah, I definitely think there is. I think all scientists are really excited, normally very excited to work with animators, because they think that we're going to do explainer videos for their science. And it's kind of like there's that thing of it, you know, sort of like having the conversation where I'm an animated documentary maker, and we're going to make a documentary together, and you will of course have a massive input in it, but it's not necessarily just going to be to explain your science. So Language of Shapes was the second film that I'd made with Serge Mostow, who is based at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and his work is microbiology. And so all of it is imperceptible to the human eye, but also more than that, the verbal and the visual language that's used to express his science is very difficult for a layperson to really pass. You know, you can't really get a grip of what he's doing just from looking at images of his work, because it's unreadable to someone who doesn't have a scientific background. So by working with an animator, it kind of opens it up in a really different way, which I think he found really exciting and thrilling. And we ended up, in fact, projection mapping the film and projecting it onto the side of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which was dead exciting for him, because he's one of the few microbiology labs at the London School. So literally his work is unseen a lot of the time, and it's very kind of, it's almost marginalized within that, you know, not that it's not important, but just that there's not many of them. So by making it so huge, we were kind of commenting through the content on the way in which microbiology is seen. So yeah, I think scientists find it very freeing to, you know, to work in that way, but it's up to us as animators to explain that part of the process. I always run animation workshops, for example, with collaborators, so they understand the process of animation as much as I understand the process of science, because animation can't always be like a service industry. I mean, of course, in some ways, it absolutely can be, but in other ways, it's important that that dialogue is, you know, kind of of equal partners.
So do they often come to you with very sort of set ways, and then you have to sort of almost re-educate them?
I think in general, most scientists that I've worked with haven't been very confident with visuals. That they don't feel very, like, if you ask them to draw, it's kind of like asking them to sing. You know, they're like, what, in front of you? No, you know, I'm not going to do that. Yeah, so they perhaps have sort of set ideas about the language, the verbal language, but the visual language they're normally very open to.
Great, thanks very much for that. I'm going to hop on now, and we'll come back to some of those themes, I'm sure. But I'd like to ask Alex now a couple of questions, just to sort of set the scene for your work. You know, and you mentioned there that you've been studying animated documentary ethics. What do you think are the main strands you're exploring there? Does the animated documentary maker have responsibilities to facts, or even making clear their own bias? Could you talk about how this is explored in maybe one of your films, like Drawing on Autism? Mike needs to be switched on.
Okay, yeah. I think there's a basic way to understand a sort of documentary filmmaker's ethical responsibilities is to divide it between their responsibilities to their participants, the spectator, and their own sort of creative intentions. And often those factors sit in tension throughout all decision making throughout the project. And in terms of the responsibility to the audience, often that is about expectations that come with a documentary around truth claims. Now it's a bit more complicated than that, because these films are always representations, even if it's a live action documentary, as opposed to an actual sort of experience of reality. So there's a gap, no matter what kind of documentary process you're engaged in, between reality and the filmic experience. And I think what animated documentary does very interestingly is be very upfront about that gap between my way of telling the story about what I understand about reality, and the gap between that and objective notions of reality itself. Yeah, and then in terms of the relationship to the participant, well, let's say the relationship to the filmmaker's own creative responsibility. I mean, you're afforded incredible control and creative freedom compared to a live action documentary maker. You can control how a participant behaves, what they look like, and in what context they appear. You're basically operating with an avatar puppet of them. And so with that comes all sorts of opportunities, that for problems that emerge through creative interventions with that participant. So let's say, like in Drawing on Autism, the film, I can show a clip of it in a second if you like, but I made a quick animation test working with an autistic participant, a friend of mine actually, and it was just a warm-up exercise for the PhD. But as soon as I showed it to in fact, I'm just telling the story of what happens in this clip. So maybe I should just show my clips.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I can explain it as I talk about it afterwards. So I'll show
sure, great.
This is another film first clip.
When I'm stressed, or maybe not even known I was stressed, he's come up to me and just touched my arm. And you can almost feel it draining away. I think it's like a lightning conductor, just a small touch.
What do you think he's trying to do?
I don't think he's trying to do anything. He's just empathetic.
So he understands how you see things?
He understands how you feel. Probably better than you do. What he thinks is a mystery to me. I've no idea what's going on in his head. Maybe nothing is. It could be a total blank.
When I was speaking to my supervisor the other day, I told him about this little clip. And he was like, oh, it's funny. I mean, when I watch it now, first thing I thought when I looked at that character design was, he looks like an alien.
Well, there is. I mean, that metaphor is used a bit, and maybe, yeah. I didn't think alien. I thought gangly bald guy.
Yeah, well, that's what I thought as well. Let's say I did unconsciously represent you as an alien. How do you feel about that?
Maybe, I don't know, maybe I unconsciously want to enter your body through your pores and then germinate a copy of myself in your belly and burst out of you.
Is there? Well, I'm definitely leading you in this conversation. So
yeah, and I'm
you don't want to
deliberately being a little.
Well, I mean, is it because I'm being too sensitive? I'm being too cautious, too paranoid about representation?
Well, I mean, it didn't occur to me. It is a. I'm trying to remember. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I might have been called alien in the playground a few times actually. When I was very young.
What I'm trying to do is work out whether I've done a bad job or a good job, or I shouldn't worry so much.
Well, I guess in the context of your research, it's food for thought. In the context of you just doing an animation exercise, I don't know. I didn't feel misrepresented. In some levels, I kind of enjoy that meme being out there now.
I think it is a little bit masochistic. I really want to be told that I'm wrong and learn from that. And it doesn't seem like it's happening in this meeting between us.
Well, I mean, I'm sure there's people you can pay to do that.
Okay. What I was getting to was to talk about the possibilities for all sorts of unconscious expressions of your perceptions or perspectives on what the participant represents to you, emerging through, this vastly greater number of creative decisions made in an animated documentary. So, yeah, I mean, but I must give credit to Sam Moore for hugely influencing me in my sort of methodology around collaborative, reflexive cycle of feedback. So Sam had her cycle of feedback improving the accuracy of these brain state phenomena representations. But what I found was that the conversations we were having about these representations and possible problems that may come with them were also quite fascinating, and I started including them into the film. So it was a way of sort of finding insurance policies, more or less, ways of reducing ethical risks around sort of intervening in someone's life, particularly if they are marginalized or vulnerable.
Yeah, thanks. And it was very interesting how you put yourself in the animation, as if to remind people how mediated it actually is. So, there's a great quote that you give about, through collaborative feedback, I attempt to share responsibilities with my participants. But the thing is, which I'm interested in is, you're still essentially the one doing the animation. What stops you from pushing the collaborative process even further? Other animators have, got. I mean, Tim Webb with His Autism springs to mind. Get the participants to animate. Are you going in that direction, or do you want still heavily being in control?
Yeah, I think, Sam referred to this a little bit. At some point there's a line where you have to say, well, I have a responsibility as the director, but picking that line, particularly when your goal is to develop, the experiment I was doing with drawing on autism is what happens if my aim is to make as ethical a film as possible. What strange consequences to come out in the film. Tim Webb's sort of iconic animated documentary from '92, AS for Autism, it uses drawings generated by autistic participants, or even just school children who contributed to the project. And there are some animators who animated their own scenes, but it's mostly done by Tim and one of his colleagues. And I think that's really, it was an amazing film that in many ways predicted so many innovations in the neurodiversity movement itself. You know, predicting the sort of strong emphasis on nothing about us without us. But at the same time, there is a very particular trope in autism representations of infantilization. And one of the contributors on that film is Temple Grandin, who was in her 50s at the time of the film and was an industrial engineer, a very fine draftsperson, but you know, her contributions to the film were animated with little stickmen, sort of on scribbly drawings. And I think, you know, that the reason that trope is in particular problem is because it reflects the incentives and interests and investment that comes along with the concerns and lobbying of parents of autistic people, rather than autistic activists who are speaking on, or self-advocates, let's say. So, I mean, but I think the problem would apply in all participatory documentary practice. You have to find some sort of line, and maybe it is you're a co-author with 5 other people, or maybe you're not. And I think there is a certain, if I wanted to make a documentary about bankers, and I got them to do the animations for their own scene, well, they'd end up looking a little naive. And so I think there is a limit when there's such a high threshold for skills and investment in time and training to be able to get up to the standard of animation practice, and the sort of, the connotations of that.
Yeah, thank you very much, and very eloquently put. I'd like to move now to Mary and just answer a few questions, and then we'll give to Jonathan, and then we'll open it up. And also, if anybody has any questions, you can see there's a question already, so we'll keep to time to get those as well. So Mary, you know, I'd like to sort of ask you about, you know, you tend to interrogate the lens-based image with direct action. You know, I've seen your work with drawing and mark making and what looks like optical printing technique from 16mm film. Is tactility important to you? The ability to physically alter the film? Sorry, you have to put your mic on.
Typical. Yeah, no, definitely. I think with The Divide, which I finished last year, and it was screened at LIAF last year, that I think that's a really good example of where I really begin to work and think more deeply about sort of the materiality of film itself, and kind of linking this back to sort of experimental animation, cameraless filmmaking, all these really early techniques that are kind of forgotten. And I know there's been sort of this resurgence and this interest in analog filmmaking again, but I think for me 10 years ago, nobody was that interested in it, but it was just a process that I kind of continued to kind of develop. But in Something More, it was about the scratching into film was actually quite symbolic of the knife, because Something More is about, you know, the youth knife crime epidemic in London. So those marks, the scratching actually was symbolic of a knife, and kind of this way it was moving around sort of the city. And you see this kind of playful kind of lines of abstraction, but sometimes the abstract creates a feeling and a mood, and this expressive mark making, I think, can kind of speak to the audience in a way, and it gives them time to reflect sort of on what they're hearing as well. So that's another good thing about animated documentaries, that you're controlled by the sound, the dialogue, the narrative, and these visuals are kind of interlaced into these narratives, and you know, you are controlling it in a way. As much as we do use the stories and the words of the people, participants, as a director, you're controlling the direction of that narrative and how that unfolds, the pauses, you know, those silences, the moments that they speak, what they say, how they say it. All of that is, as a director, you're kind of, you know, controlling that. that way of working. But yeah, that I really like to play with sort of the physicality and the materiality of analog filmmaking. And I feel like it's a shame to lose those early forms of filmmaking.
Yeah, and whilst we're at it, do you want to just give out your URL so that people know where to see your films?
Yeah, so something more. It's not online yet, so
okay.
It is online on a website called For Fighting Knife Crime London, and it's recently been put online. But here's my website. But if you search for it, you might be able to see like you'll probably see the trailer and like a clip of it. But that was where sort of the analog and the kind of traditional forms of animation and the digital forms of animation, it was very collage style of working, but I felt that was necessary because of the complexity of the issue. And I think with animated documentary, sometimes the stories or the subject is very complex.
From the window, I can see the remnants.
Oops.
Oh, someone's playing it. But yeah, so even then, it's like even live action can't always grasp these nuances and these issues that are so very subtle. But animation can really enhance that and bring that to the forefront.
On your site, you talk about yourself as a multidisciplinary artist, and I think that's a great way of putting it rather than pigeonholing yourself. And I was particularly interested in your exhibition, The Living Quality of Light, Time and Form, at the TACO or TACO Artist Space in Thamesmead. Did seeing your work in a physical space extend possibilities for you? Because Sam also mentioned, the physical world and projecting on the side of a building. But for you, did working in a physical space extend your work?
Yeah, definitely. I remember seeing the work in that gallery space, and it kind of took a whole different meaning, as opposed to being on a small screen, to being in a kind of a cinema size screen. So I feel like the way that the work is screened also has an impact on sort of how the message is delivered as well. Because at the Thamesmead Arts and Culture Office, you're kind of drawn into this space, this room with just these two speakers. And I think the audience kind of probably might listen more when you're in that kind of environment. So I do think like the space and the environment that you set the work in also has an impact on it as well. And so yeah, definitely. And I think my work has always been kind of interchanging between gallery space and a large kind of screen. And it's really, it's an unusual one for me because I've never quite known where I fit in. I feel like I'm sort of in the middle of this kind of this art world / film world. It's very, so from when I make my work, I'm very conscious of where I want this work to be displayed. That kind of also controls the methods.
Yeah.
As well.
Everybody likes to have labels, don't they? And calling you folks animated documentary makers is a label which may mean something to certain people and doesn't tell the whole story. I'd like to hop on now, if I may, to Jonathan. Looking at time, and Jonathan, I've got a couple of questions for you, and I know one particular question we're going to go into in more depth. But the first question is, in 2008, I think you were animation director for the very influential Age of Stupid. And I'm mentioning that because I wanted to know if at that time that opened doors for you, because it was, a very influential film. Did it open doors for you, or did it give you a strong direction regarding animated documentaries?
Virtually bankrupted me. I mean, I was on the minimum wage for about 9 months with a family to feed, so that's why I went into teaching, to get regular money. It didn't open doors for me, no. I've been making animated documentaries, well, as I was saying before, since I was 19, so I just hadn't called them animated documentaries. But I'd made a lot of animated documentaries before that, which were commissioned. I think it might have helped a bit maybe with some things, but I think it was other work that, to be honest, films that I've made which weren't animated documentaries opened more doors for me than the animated documentaries. I get asked to do more animated documentaries, but I get asked to do quite a lot of human rights type animated documentaries, but actually that's not I don't really think I'm an expert in that area. It's because I happen to have I've done them and I get asked to do them again. So yeah, no, it didn't open doors for me. Open the door into Middlesex University, perhaps.
Okay, we may well go back to that, but let me ask a second question then, because I noticed your short Roughhouse was originally going to be an animated documentary, but in fact it became something else, didn't it? It was like recollections of student life in 80s Liverpool, but very fictionalized it. You know, you very much fictionalized what happened back in the day, back in your day. Do you think some subjects have more impact if they are fictionalized?
Well, I mean, it was a documentary to start out with because I had 4 failed attempts to get funding for the film. That wasn't the reason why I switched to it being a story based on real events, but it was just really that I didn't really want to tell the events exactly as they happened. I wanted to sort of embellish things a bit, and also I really, you know, I didn't want to name people, or I wanted to make a story that was based around something that happened, and the main point is still there. That the important point was that it's somebody got picked on very badly because they didn't have the money to pay the rent. That's the thing that's true about that story. But a lot of things that happened in the narrative are sort of made up or exaggerated, and so it's a drama really. It's and you know, if you looked at the real events, it was a lot of it was rather boring actually. So you know, relentless kind of picking on someone in rather boring ways, but you know, so yeah, so I kind of thought it was easier to kind of take it out of the documentary sphere and go somewhere else with it. I mean, I am really interested in how far you can push a documentary and it still be you can still argue that it's a documentary. I mean, I think it's a really interesting, and that's one of the things that most interests me about animated documentary is how far you can push it. I mean, the trouble with Love and Sex, which I made over 10 years ago now, but that was a completely fabricated world with people who seemed to be turning up at the same counseling office, but they all lived in reality. These people lived in different towns. But the points that were being made with that film, which I made with Zach Beatty, who's a very you know, revered animation, live action documentary maker. The points that were being made were still, I think, it got to the truth of the matter, but without actually saying, you know, word for word what happened. So I don't know if I've answered the question at all, but yeah.
I was just going to say, there's a really interesting point there about animated documentary that you make, Jonathan, which is that part of this, and Annabelle Honest-Ray talks about this, you know, one of the things that makes a documentary, animated documentary, is that we call it documentary, like, and if we choose to not call it documentary and call it fictionalized, we're not going to fight off the documentary police. They're not going to come around and say, you know, you failed the test. You know what I mean? It's like, and with that's true for all documentary filmmaking, but particularly with animated documentary, because there is no indexical visual link. You know, it's like, it's documentary because I say it is, and because it's received in a documentary way, because it has a level of seriousness about it. But if I choose to kind of like take the mick all the way through, and then I can call it a, you know, a kind of like faux documentary, a mockumentary or whatever, or I can choose to say this is all fictionalized, none of this really happened. You know, I think that's maybe where some of the tension arises for the audience, and maybe more for the kind of the audience, the critical audience, because like, whose word are we going by? And maybe that's also why we have such an obsession with ethics and collaboration, and, you know, the proving the truth of, you know, the truth claims of what we're saying, because how else do we claim this?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't. I mean, I hadn't really coined the phrase animated documentary till I've been doing animation for about sort of 20 years, I think. So, and I thought, oh, actually, yeah, I could call this animated documentary. But and you can just as easily not call it animated documentary.
Yeah,
I'm guessing the word documentary is more loaded than animation. You know, a documentary seems to imply a truth, an authoritative truth. And when it's mixed with animation, which is the kind of primordial soup of imagination, if you like, you know, you get all sorts of things. And maybe we should also mention that there was last night, I think, an animated documentary session at LIAF. So if any of you who are listening into this want to know more about animated documentaries, have a look at that session last night. And there's a whole range there of animation which you might not have even thought of as animated documentaries. You know, so I think it's an interesting phrase that means so many different things. And I think also Bella Hannes Rowe talks about it as an alternative worldview. That's another kind of way of looking at animated documentary. I'd like to just quickly ask you, because we're in the last straits here. I'd like to ask all of you this, because I think you're all involved in some way, and that is something that I mentioned earlier on. That this idea that there is an idea that, you know, Gen Z, the sort of young people coming up, are particularly interested in animated documentaries as a way of telling a truth to about themselves, or sort of minorities, or other people, and bringing their conversations to the screen. Those of you in education, maybe, are you finding that, you know, young people are seeing this format as a one to use, or are they still, you know, I think animation students tend to sort of always head towards the sort of fantasy, you know, manga, anime, or you know, being whatever they see currently on their screens. Are you finding that there's an upswell of people interested in animation documentaries?
I think it's depends on the level you're at in education. I think undergraduate probably not so much, but postgraduate more, because they've had more experience. They've been exposed to more animated documentary, possibly.
I mean, as looking at the submissions to FAF every year, we get quite a survey of what kind of films are coming out in the universities. And, you know, it's always a big part of our program. And it's certainly that there's a growth in sort of family films, films. I mean, I've made them as well. Jonathan has as well. And I think there's something about finding yourself in a situation where you've been given a brief, you've got to make a film, and maybe you know, that story in the family is the thing that really is interesting you. And this is such a personal way of storytelling, where you get to sort of visualize your thoughts about this intimate relationship, often around grief as well. That's a big theme in student films that I've noticed recently. Yeah, so I think it's an opportunity both to sort of steer away from maybe some of the indulgent aspects of fantasy and storytelling, and maybe take yourself a bit more seriously as a documentary maker, but also you know, it comes with it less of a journalistic approach that Mary was talking about, and much more of a personal storytelling and more reflective approach I've seen from a lot of, yeah, particularly MA students.
Sam, what would you say? RCA. Sorry, Mary, I can see you want to say.
No, I was gonna just agree with everything that Alex and Jonathan has said about that level of engagement tends to come with more sort of experience, kind of more life experience, kind of understanding what your practice is, what it means to you, you know, having sort of a vision of where you're heading with your work. And I think that at undergraduate level is not quite there yet. It's in development for some people, but I think when they get to MA level and they're beginning to kind of specialize more, then we kind of see more engagement, especially with my work. It's more the students, not even just animation students, but students from other disciplines that want to engage with animation as well. But that could come at postgraduate level as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say at RCA, we definitely have many students who are kind of fascinated by the possibilities that using documentary in an animation inflected way offers them. You know, it's just, and I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. You know, I don't think fantasy and documentary are mutually exclusive. They're all part of the same. They're part, you know, they're just part of the tools that we can use. But yeah, perhaps at master's level you have more opportunity to kind of think about those, open them up, and think about different ways to express yourself. Yeah. And that's, but I mean, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here because both Alex and Mary are RCA graduates who did animated documentaries, so proof of the pudding.
And Jonathan.
Well, so am I, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, I don't. But they specifically did like animated documentary at RCA. But yeah, it wasn't a thing when you were there. I don't think.
Yeah. Well, one thing I just when I was there. Yeah.
One thing I'd like to add is like something I've noticed much more of in recent submissions to FAF are mock animated documentaries, films that use the sort of storytelling devices, the tropes, but it's actually incredibly hard to figure out whether or not it's intended as a documentary or just sort of using these. And I think that is definitely to do with a generational shift towards a sort of familiarity and literacy in both post-truth and postmodern ironies and reflections and sort of, you know, the hall of mirrors of meaning and I think that, yeah, so we've been struggling actually to identify what is and isn't an animated documentary, and it's often down to a vibe at first, and then we actually have to do a lot of research and figure out we're wrong. So it's an ongoing, and there's no real right answer. It's honestly opinion.
Mary, I think you wanted to come in as well.
What was I going to say? No, I wanted to touch upon what Sam said about sort of that animated documentary pathway at RCA. I just remember some of us were like, I don't know, we're not just animated, we're not just documentary, because it was experimental documentary and narrative. And then I was like, oh, actually, I make experimental documentaries that have this narrative. Do I fall into all three? So I just feel like the documentary, it really just does explore more than just this documentary element. It is very experimental, and it might be more traditional storytelling. It might be quite abstract. It's, yeah. So it kind of crosses over into so many different areas of just film, animation, and literature, and, you know, it's just could be poetic at times. And so, yeah.
Yeah, just to say, we don't have those pathways anymore. Yeah. So because I completely agree with you, I would consider my work to be narrative, experimental, and documentary. And how do you know, gosh, we live in enough boxes. We don't need any more, thanks. You know, animation is a kind of super medium. We want to explore all of it. It's really exciting what it can do. You know, you can expand it in so many ways.
Yeah, I just want, we're coming towards the end now, but I have one question about process. We've talked a bit about outputs. We you know, the image of the animator is traditionally sometimes seen as a monastic pursuit. You sit there in your darkened room and you're in your own world with your own screen. But it seems that animated documentaries are always about collaboration or partnership in some way. You know, we talked a bit about the power of the animator as you know, in control, but you know, with animated documentaries, you try and collaborate or partner. You're often speaking on behalf of others. And is there a social side to making animated documentaries? Do you need social skills? Are you lot all empathetic and socially aware people? And do you have to have that in your toolbox if you want to make an animated documentary?
It's so funny. Mary and I are both nodding, and Jonathan's shaking his head furiously.
No, it's just you don't have to make animated films with other people. You can make an animated documentary completely on your own without speaking to anyone. I mean, that's the beauty of animation, is you can just sit in a dark room and for 3 years and not speak to anybody. I mean, obviously it's not very healthy, but I mean, a lot of people do that, and I've done that, and I am doing it whenever I get the chance. Yeah,
I think
I do like working with other people, but I also like just sort of completely just being completely self-centered and not caring what anyone else thinks.
Alex, what's your take?
I mean, it's very anecdotal, but you go to a festival that's geared towards live action filmmakers. The conversations are often about, I'm talking about me. And then you go to the documentary film festivals, they're very intrusive. They ask lots of probing questions. And then you go to the animation festivals, and it's much more modest and introverted and sort of quiet and less egotistical. And I think that, these tendencies, they're not universal at all, but, you can sort of pick up on vibes that talk. And I think, Sam said it earlier, there is a certain sort of intrusiveness that documentary filmmakers, they're keen to learn how you tick and be a little bit provocative in their question asking. And yeah, it's certainly something I've noticed, and I think I do myself.
Sam and Mary, you're in the sociability
Yeah,
group,
big time. No, I think collaboration is really important. I think a lot of filmmaking, I mean, I totally get your point, Jonathan. You can make a film by yourself in a darker room, but then you're going to work with, like, maybe if you're lucky, you get a good producer, you've got a sound designer you've got to communicate with, you've got a composer that you're working with, you might have assistants to do some work for you. Like, filmmaking in general is a collaborative process, and so folding in a collaborative consultant as an interviewee or as someone who's going to comment on the look of it and show how they're being represented, I think is like a really lovely thing that we can do. And because animation is so iterative and it takes such a long time, we can evolve those, Visible Mending took 5 years. One of the main interviewees died during the making of the film, and she knew she was going to die before the film came out, and and that was kind of central to her testimony as part of her contribution to the film. I mean, that is some deep level, that's some heavy stuff which we tried to, really fold in and not make it depressing, but, really make it part of the, kind of joy of the film as well as the sadness. So I think, yeah, I love that about animation. It can be so complex and so layered, so multi-layered.
And Mary, tell us a bit about the social skills that you've had to use to work with groups.
My gosh, yeah. I mean, patience. You need a lot of patience when you're working with people, and a lot of people if you're working with communities, they don't feel comfortable leaving their environment, their space. So you're running around. I'm constantly running around, going to wherever they are, because I think making them feel comfortable also brings out this level of authenticity in the work. So yeah, being able to communicate with them and also build that trust, and you build that trust through developing a relationship with them. So you can't just turn up, record, answer them a bunch of questions, and then go and make a film. I feel like you need to get to know them and they need to get to know you. And it's nice because at the end of it, you have like a new friend, or you've made these new friends, and because their lives, their voices, part of them living within that animation and will forever be within that animation. So it's a nice feeling to kind of develop these new working relationships.
Great. And on that, we've come towards the end, but I just wanted to Anastasia's question, and she asks, how do you all choose animation techniques for your films? Because you know, a number of you have used different techniques, different media approaches to different films. So, how do you choose your animation techniques? Do you just, you know, can you just take them to the peg, or you know, what makes you choose a certain technique for a certain film? Let's start off with Jonathan. He's looking very quizzical.
Well, I tend to draw most of the time, so you know so I tend to use the same materials a lot of the time, and I think you it's the sort of idea, really, isn't it? It's what the film's about, was often, you know, dictate the materials that you use. Obviously, Sam's films about knitting, and so obviously there's a reason for using wool in that film. But I mean, yeah, I think every film there's a reason for the material you use. It's not usually arbitrary, but obviously it has to be something that, well, quite often it has to be something that you feel comfortable working with. And I always found I'm still learning to draw, and still trying to get better at drawing, and that's the thing that sort of drives me to keep making drawn films.
Alex, you know, the clips that you showed, there was a number of different styles there. So what's your approach to style and different animation techniques?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to produce a sort of level of instability in the representation through switching between styles, because, you know, when you switch, you're sort of reminded that you're in this artificial rendering of reality, and it was a reflexive device to not let people sit too comfortably with the storytelling and the sort of illusion of truth. But Anastasia, I mean, we've talked about this many times, and she's dissatisfied with my disinterest in trying to link my materiality to my storytelling. I just really love 2D animation, and I've experimented with other stuff, but it's right where I feel most expressive and confident, and so it's not necessarily has a symbolic layer to it.
So, Mary, do you think you have a style?
No, not really, not yet. I'm still working on it, but I do think the narrative, the themes do dictate the medium, the kind of materials that I use a lot. And I combine sort of the traditional analog, hand drawn, the digital. I think I've thrown in some stop motion. It's very, very mixed media. Sometimes I think it's probably a bit too much, but I do think the narrative and what people share with me, I really kind of absorb that. And then I kind of try and release that through my expressive work of just this collage of different techniques and stuff. So it might get a bit more contained in the future, but for now, I like to experiment with the medium as well as with the stories as well.
Great, thank you.
Oh, sorry. Can I just say something, because I've got a whole talk I do about materiality and it's comment on content, but I think it's so important. I think it's another one of the tools at our disposal. I totally respect the choice not to, you know, change the medium in the way that you do it, but as someone who made an entire film made on knickers and 80 meters of crepe de chine because I was making an animated documentary about a knicker factory, like, I really think it's a lovely way of kind of like, you know, using that tactility, that kind of, you know, that sort of haptic feedback of, you know, what you're seeing and what you're feeling, and, you know, it's like it is another tool at our disposal in order to comment on what is happening within the film. So I think if you want to use that, I think it's a beautiful kind of option, but I'm obviously completely biased and also quite a crap animator, so yeah.
Well, we're all biased, and on that note, I have to have the authorial content to actually shut this down now, because we've gone way over. Thank you so much. We could have gone on all night, but unfortunately there's other things at the festival. But I'd like to thank Alex, Jonathan, Mary, and Sam for sharing their pictures with us and food for thought. And please do search out their films and watch what they do, because we're going to sort of see a lot more from them. And thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you again sometime. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. Thanks.